Substantial progress in the China-U.S. trade negotiations push back the March 1st deadline for increasing U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. What does that mean, and how far away are we from a trade deal? And U.S. aid seems to be fueling Venezuela's escalating political crisis. Goodwill or children house? What's behind the U.S.'s gesture? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Bixin. A very good weekend for the U.S. and China, tweeted U.S. President Donald Trump. The president announced in the Sunday night tweet that he will delay the U.S. increase in tariffs scheduled for March the 1st in the wake of productive talks between the world's two biggest economies. Extending the deadline would mean putting on hold a slated increase to 25% from 10% on $200 billion of Chinese imports into the U.S. The seventh round of such negotiations since last February was extended by 2 days in order to address specific issues such as technology transfer, intellectual property protection, non-tariff barriers, service industry, agriculture and exchange rates, according to Xinhua, China's official news agency. Now, both sides were drafting an MOU, but President Trump on Friday said he wanted a trade agreement instead, and that he would meet Chinese President Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago in the U.S. to conclude an agreement in March. What does the delay of the March 1st deadline tell us about the progress made? What kind of impact will trade agreement instead of an MOU have on bilateral trade? Joining me for the discussion are Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics, and Robert Moran, Partner at the Brunswick Insight in Washington. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Gong, first, please explain to us, what does the delay mean? How far apart are we from a deal?
I think we're very close to the deal. We're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think the reason that he extended the deadline is because he wants to resolve this whole negotiation issue with President Xi that is scheduled to take place towards the end of March in Florida, in his resort Mar-a-Lago. So I think that's the background behind this. And I think this is actually, we all see it, very positive news coming from Washington, that two sides are getting very close towards some middle ground here. And I think I would call it that the deal is, this trade deal is around the corner. It's very close.
Robert, what does this delaying of mean to you?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how to read it. I mean, first we have to admit that trade wars are generally not good for anyone involved. You have two sides that want somewhat different things here. I think from the American perspective, the president and the American negotiators want a better deal on currency, protection of IP, more level playing field, etc. It seems like the Chinese negotiators have offered quite a bit in terms of agricultural product purchasing, but I'm not sure that gets to the underlying concerns that Washington has about intellectual property and 21st century technologies. So I'm not exactly sure what this tells us. The president loves to be a deal maker, and he loves these summits. But I'm not clear yet on where we're at today.
Well, at least in the words of President Donald Trump, that they've had productive talks, and both sides, both the Chinese official news agency Xinhua and President Trump have used the word substantive progress, which is quite amazing. I mean, given the kind of difference they've had in their version of stories in the past. I want to show you again that Xinhua story that I read in the beginning of this discussion. According to the Xinhua, negotiators focused, and I want to see that graphics again, please, to my editors. According to Xinhua, the negotiators focused their talks on the text of an agreement and achieved substantial progress on some specific issues. I want to talk about the word agreement. We all know the discussion that was had in the Oval Office last Friday when President Trump contradicted the chief negotiator, Trade Representative Lighthizer, saying he doesn't want an MOU, but rather he wants a trade agreement. John, what's the difference between an MOU and an agreement?
Let me first talk about the Bob's argument. I think it's more than just, so far we have achieved is more than just about some purchase of American agricultural products. I mean, it's clearly reported that there are 6 MOUs written so far, going into details of all these structural issues the American side has been talking about. And also we are talking about those enforcement issues. So I just can't imagine we're talking about these enforcement issues if we just reached some agreement on agricultural purchases. So having said that, I want to talk about the difference between MOU and a trade agreement. I think in a substance, really, there's not much of a difference here. These are mostly about semantics, in my opinion. The way previously Lai has been working is to draft these several MOUs, and these MOUs will be independent chapters going into a formal document. You call it a free trade agreement or not, it doesn't really matter. I think it's kind of an agreement between the two governments. But obviously President Trump doesn't like this word MOU, because I guess it's mostly coming from his business background in the real estate market. He probably thinks that MOU is something not enforceable, but I think in this context, MOU, this is a discussion between two government delegations. So this is not MOU in a sort of a commercial transaction sense. So I think the difference is really in semantics.
Okay, Robert, your take on the question?
Yeah, I think it was purely a confusion about semantics. I think that the president comes from the business world, but not diplomacy and not trade negotiations. And I think he was simply confused and didn't quite understand that these are how things are negotiated in the modern era. And I think it's simply a semantic level of confusion, mostly on his part.
All right. Well, does it make a difference, John, for the Chinese, whether it's called a trade deal or trade agreement or MOU? Obviously, Liu He, the vice premier, agreed on the spot, saying that it's okay if you want to call it a trade agreement, we'll call it a trade agreement. So the Chinese doesn't really mind how the wording was.
Exactly. I don't think it makes much of a difference from my perspective. Let me finish. I think there are some reports here in China talking about whether this agreement, if it's going to call a trade agreement, is it going to go through Congress or not. I just want to make a note that this has nothing to do with the United States Congress. It's purely a deal between Chinese government and the executive branch of the U.S. government. It doesn't touch upon any tariff issues from the American side. Therefore, it doesn't invoke any constitutional authority from the United States Congress. So it's nothing to do with the U.S. Congress in this perspective.
Okay, I want to bring back what the Xinhua talked about, reported on after after the 7th round, the 6th round of negotiations. The Xinhua said the two sides had candid, specific and constructive discussions about issues of common concern, which included trade balance, technology transfer and so on and so forth. Whereas this time, as I said, they focused their talks on the text of an agreement and achieved substantial progress. John, coming from understanding the Chinese culture, how much of a difference does these two versions say about the Chinese official understanding of the progress that has been made?
I think, in the subtlety of the language, I think it implies a lot of messages here. I think we are really a step moving ahead, and we are very close to concluding a deal here. Taking into account that Vice Premier Liu He stayed in Washington for 2 more days, and they're really talking about scheduling a summit between our two presidents. That means something. And I just can't fathom a scenario where the two greatest presidents in the world meet and they walk away with nothing. It's just not going to happen. So I think these are all very good signs. And I think if we want to really predict what's the outcome of this rounds and rounds of negotiations, let's just look at if the summit is going to happen now. If the summit is scheduled, it's going to happen, I'm pretty sure we're in the basket.
Yeah, President Trump that he's looking forward to meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping sometime in March. So that means we are not far from a deal being inked. And yet, Robert, what's the likelihood, until we have a deal in our hand, until we can see it with our own eyes, what's the likelihood that things can derail the last minute? And what are some of the factors on the U.S. side that could give us a big surprise?
Right. This is why I'm still keeping an open mind about this coming to a conclusion. I think there are some open questions about the president and how he makes deals and how he operates. I agree with the other host that you wouldn't have both presidents together at Mar-a-Lago unless you were going to make a big announcement and the deal was basically done. I agree with that. I just think that this is still somewhat of a winding road with the president and his deal-making personality. I think there's also a second issue here, which is just the U.S. politics of it all. You know, we just finished up some research around the world, including in the United States, that looks at Chinese businesses going global. And while 51% of Americans think that trade with China is fair, 49% think it's unfair. And so you have in the United States a political issue here, especially with the president's own political base. Some hardliners in his base want to see him get tougher in these negotiations, so I think that could complicate things. I also think there's farm state politics running into an election year. Keep in mind, some of the trade war rhetoric is good for the president politically in key states that he wants to win in the next election, but it appears that the world economy is slowing down, and it would appear to be in everyone's interest to wrap this up and come to a conclusion. So there are some countervailing forces here at play, and I think the president clearly would like to get a deal and put this behind him and declare victory and move on, especially alleviate some potential harm in farm country.
Right.
Well, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. But I think one of the key issues on everybody's lip is structural issues. President Trump tweeted on February the 25th that I am pleased to report that the U.S. has made substantial progress in our trade talks with China on important structural issues, including IP protection, technology transfer, agriculture, services, currency, and many other issues. But he also said on a different occasion that structural reform means something different for both governments. So, John, what does structural reform mean for China, and what do you understand that it means for the United States? Does the two sides have an overlapping common understanding on this issue here?
Well, first of all, we have to treat President Trump's tweet with a grain of salt. I mean, clearly agriculture issue is not a structural issue here, but of course he included this as a structural issue. I think what he meant by structural issues being perceived differently, respectively in China and the United States, is respect the kind of changes that he would like to introduce in China, but nevertheless our government probably would be reluctant to go after some of the changes he would like to have. I think that's the difference he's talking about. For example, there are things that we're ready to make changes, for example, with respect to intellectual property protection, with forced technology transfer. For these things, I think are relatively easier to address. But if we talk about things related to the very core of our economic system, things like industrial policy, treatment of state-owned enterprises, these are probably more thorny issues here. And certainly, I think our two governments have a very different perspectives on these issues. Okay. That's I think what we're different now.
All right, we're running out of time, but we will talk about this in the next days. Many thanks to Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics, and Robert Moran, partner at Brunswick Insight in Washington, D.C.